you have an obligation to act. That's what we're trying to talk about. The culture of the organization has been to sweep things under the carpet, and that's the part that we're changing. And so it's about speaking up and doing something about it with the proper processes and training, choosing the right people so that they can actually act appropriately and stop these things from festering to the point where they blow up into a giant problem that makes it much more harder on everybody to deal with.
Okay. I think that's actually a really good entry point and a segue, and I'd like to continue with you, sir, if you may, because you talked about how often this is an instance or a culture between employees and not necessarily coming down from management, and yet it's fairly clear in this report that there are fears of reprisals. So in your opinion, with the culture of reprisal, with the culture of sweeping things under the rug, in your opinion, would that still be at the staff level, or would that not, in fact, be led by the culture in the direction of management?
Well, I think that management has to sort of pay attention to what's going on. And as I said, where there's smoke, there's fire often. And if they see something going on, then they have to sort of insert themselves into that conversation or whatever's happened and either try and solve it informally, but to let it get to the point where it's a formal complaint that has to be put into place, quite frankly, that's a failure. So I think that the more that you understand what's happening with your teams and nip things in the bud, the better off we're all going to be. That means training for managers. That means soft skills training. That means
if I could interject at that moment, in 2018, when senior management spoke with staff across the country to understand the concerns, in addition, in the summer of 2018, you approved the development of a strategy. It wasn't in place at the end of the audit period. Could you explain why the respectful workplace strategy approved in July 2018 was not in place?
Well, yes, I can actually. Thank you for the question. So what we started with was something very basic, which was a listening tour. So soon after my arrival and having worked in another organization where I really believe that understanding the culture was a critical element to making any kind of change, and not getting the kind of feedback from the surveys that have been done either with respect by the AG or even the PSES survey, it wasn't helping us understand the issue. So we went around the country and held dozens and dozens of sessions with employees in very sort of Chatham House rules kinds of ways and said, okay, what's going on? And that, first of all, that did two things. It gave us better insight into what was going on. And secondly, it started to build trust that we're listening and that we're going to do something and we're taking it seriously. And we're just starting to see the benefits of that. We're doing a little pulse check surveys now, and especially to the previous
what were some of your takeaways? And I'll preface this to say that I'm alarmed when I hear that the visible minorities within your organization, the folks who are providing advisory capacities to you, are formed by itself. Like, that tells me that they saw it upon themselves that there was a challenge. They formed an advisory committee. What are some of your takeaways from this type of advisory function?
Well, they didn't quite form by itself, but there was a champion that was put in place, and that champion basically brought them into place. But absolutely, it was resounding support for something like this. And I think it's just about the shift of the tone.
If I could, but specifically, sir, what were your takeaways? What have you learned from the advisory functions of groups who are organizing to help improve the culture in the workplace?
That we need to speak openly and honestly about what's going on.
Okay. Well, it does appear that I have about 30 seconds left, so I'll reserve the remainder of my questions and comments in a more succinct way to our friends from Corrections at the appropriate time, Madam Chair.
Thank you so much, Mr. Green. To our second round of questioning. It's a 5-minute round, starting with Mr. Lawrence.
Thank you very much, and I would thank my colleagues for their learned questions so far. I've certainly benefited from that, and I also would like to thank our witnesses for the progress that they have made, and also recognizing that through the pandemic, they've I'm sure both had some difficult times, especially Mr. Ossowski working through the borders. I'm sure that you're working hard to keep all Canadians safe, so I appreciate that. And that being said, I just want to sort of walk through. So one of the key things that that I think is successful in making sure that we have a workplace that is relatively okay. Maggie, sorry, my daughter is all right, modern 2021 world is one of the things that I think is key is the vetting process. So to both the CBSA and also to the corrections, what is your process in terms of making sure that bad actors or bad apples don't get the people who are perhaps prone to these type of behaviors do not get into do not get into the CBSA or corrections?
Maybe I can start. So for us in corrections, again, it's very stressful work, and certainly we've had our challenges during COVID as well to keep everyone safe. But in terms of our recruitment, for example, our correctional officers, there is a screening process. There are tests that are administered. For example, the situational judgment tests and others to make sure that we hire the right people. And then they go through a rigorous training program. And certainly myself, as the commissioner, when we have what we call our correctional officer graduation programs, as much as possible, I attend them and I speak with them about the fact that they're peace officers. I speak with them about respect and about ethics and how important it is, and that they serve as role models to the offenders. So definitely for us, we want to ensure that we hire the best officers that we can, because it's important work that we have to do. It's with a challenging population, and they absolutely have to be role models to them.
Perfect. Over to you, Mr. Ossowski.
Thank you for the question. Yes, very similarly, we spend a lot of time up front screening applicants for certainly the frontline positions, but as well for managers. As I mentioned, we're very big on something called character-based leadership, which comes out of the Ivey School of Business at the University of Western Ontario, which is really about the exercise of judgment. And we actually assess people, we recruit people. There's a whole interview process around it to make sure that we're getting the people at the very beginning that have the right comportment, if you will, for the work. And secondly, once they're here, then it's about the training program. There's a very robust training program for frontline officers that takes close to 20 weeks to complete, much of it on campus in our own training facility. But other training in terms of creating a respectful workplace, values and ethics and disclosures of wrongdoing, mental health awareness, diversity and race relationships. We've put all of these programs in place, and we've got very high completion rates, all of them around 90% or more completion rates so far. So we keep promoting these courses and offering that support to people so that they understand that this is the workplace environment that we're in now, and we're not dwelling on the past. We're moving forward with deliberate action.
Thank you. One of the things that that you've touched upon, I think Mr. Green also touched upon, is the fact that it's so critical that people speak up. And one of the things I guess I would challenge you on, Mr. Ossowski, with all due respect, is you said that that one of the positive signs was that the amount of reports of harassment actually declined by 3% in your testimony. How do you know that that's actually meaning that there are less cases of complaints as opposed to people who it shows in the report that are fearful of reprisals? Like we've got really high numbers in both departments of 20 or 30%. How are you validating that the actual numbers of complaints are the actual violations your policies are declining as opposed to just the complaints?
A very short answer, Mr. Ossowski.
So you have to look at the whole picture in terms of the informal activities that are happening as well as the formal, and that gives you sort of the spectrum, for example, of what's going on. But I think the sessions that we're having, which I mentioned with my dedicated culture team, it's continuous engagement. And so we're having a fairly good sense, even with our pulse surveys that we're doing, what the tone of the conversation and the culture of the organization is. So you have to look at the entire spectrum of not just data, but subjective information that we're hearing from staff. And people write me emails.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. We will now move on to Mr. Sabera for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair, and good morning, everyone. Obviously, as was stated earlier on Bell Let's Talk Day today, it's not lost upon me the discussion we're having on the environment that one finds themselves in the workplace. That environment obviously extends not only to the public sector, but to the private sector across our country. And every Canadian needs to know they can go to work every day when they leave their families free of harassment, free of discrimination, and free of any nonsense, if I can use that term and sum that up. My first question to the Auditor General, page 14, to the wonderful folks at the Auditor General, of course. Page 14, when as a sort of a data person, as a finance guy, I like to look at numbers. Numbers tend to tell a story, and sometimes different stories for different people, but nonetheless tends to tell a story. And in terms of the robustness, you know, when I took my econometrics in graduate school some 25 years ago at the graduate level, we've always talked about robustness of the data sample. And when I see that nearly 16,000 employees of the CBSA were asked to participate in the survey, only the response rate was 38%. And on the Correctional Service Canada side, the survey, 19,000 employees, the response rate was 28%. How do we feel about that response rate in terms of the robustness of what comes out afterwards?
Thank you for the question, Madam Chair. So as we conducted our audit, as you indicated, we followed a sort of a sound methodology to conduct a survey. We've consulted our experts within the OAG in terms of the sampling approach and sampling sort of methodology around that. We also ensure that these percentages, as you referred to, were appropriate, and we could use them to make sort of a pass to use the survey results. So we were satisfied of these percentages that we have come to.
Thank you for that answer. Because when I think of the CBSA, and I'll turn it over to CBSA and CSC, you know, these are organizations that have a lot of front-facing individuals. Individuals that deal with the Canadian public and also people coming into this country with Canadians and non-Canadians. And obviously, I would think many of these positions that these individuals occupy are very stressful positions. And we always want to create and strive for an environment that is supportive to these individuals, and these are my thoughts when reading over the report and the actions thereof. So now I'd like to turn to first CBSA, then CSC. How do we improve these response rates so people feel comfortable, frankly, filling out these applications or answering these questions that are posed to them, to the employees at first CBSA and then CSC?
Well, thank you for the question, Madam Chair. I would just say that we're currently doing another round. The public service employment survey is happening right now, or is almost complete, and we're already seeing a higher participation rate than we have in the past, which I take as a good sign.